Hey guys, welcome, and happy Tuesday. It's me, Councilwoman Tameika Isaac Devine, and welcome to Community Conversations. This is a live community conversation that I started a couple weeks ago when we were all under quarantine and home during the day, and I felt like it was a great way for us to have really great conversations about very important issues. A lot of times people have questions, but they don't exactly know where the answers to get the answers. And so I, as your resource, I'm trying to bring you those answers. And so I'm really excited today to have with us I'd say someone I've only met personally once, but I'm a huge fan. So I have Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, who is with the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, NCRC, which I'm going to get him to tell you a little bit about. But is someone that I believe is an expert in the area of income inequality, particularly the racial wealth gap. And those of you who follow me, you know that I'm very passionate about this issue and have been talking about it, trying to elevate it in our conversation over the last several years. And last year, when I was co-chair of the National League of Cities Council on Youth Education and Families, I had the honor with my co-chair, Mayor Woodards from Tacoma, Washington, to invite Dedrick to talk to us about this issue, because we know enough to be dangerous. And as policymakers, we want to make sure that we are putting policy in place that really addresses it. But we know that we need the experts to kind of help us, because sometimes you can be very well-meaning, but you don't really know what the solutions are really to address an issue. And so it's indeed my honor and privilege to have him here. I reached out last week in a very early morning email, said, hey, I'd love to have this conversation. Can you come on? And he was just sharing with me offline that up until about last week, he was solo parenting because his wife is a public health official. And so she has been having to quarantine. And so I'm even immensely more grateful that he was willing to do this, because I know just with me trying to handle these kids here, homeschooling and everything else is difficult. So I thank you so much for being here. And welcome to Community Conversations.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be on. I think it was a great idea. That really made sense, that as everybody was at home, creating new ways of talking to your constituents. So I'm glad you created this.
Thank you so much. And like I mentioned offline, the thing is, there's so much we don't know. So I'm going to preface this by saying, y'all, I'm going to promise you guys, I'm going to bring him back, because I know y'all are going to get a taste and you're like, we need him back. We need to hear something. Hopefully when things change and we can actually get you to physically come to Columbia. When I first met you, that was kind of my hope, is that I could get you here to have a real conversation with a lot of folks in our community. But until then, we've got to keep the conversation going virtually. So first of all, I really would love for you, I think I just touched the surface. I talked about you currently now are the Chief of Race, Wealth, and Community. Is that your title, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Before then, you were with Prosperity Now. You've been with NAACP. You've been with the National Action Network. And so you've been working in this field a long time. And before we jump into kind of what the racial wealth gap is, because I think people hear it, especially right now, South Carolina, you can imagine South Carolina, we had all the presidential candidates coming through here, and everybody in one form or another talked about how they were going to address it. But I don't know if people really know what it is. So we're going to dive deep and talk about really what it is and what it isn't, and what are some of the causes. But before we get there, can you just tell us kind of your history in working in this area and where your expertise comes from?
Sure. I started off working particularly on this issue back in 2004. Like you mentioned, I worked for Reverend Sharpton, and after I left the National Action Network as a national field director, I went to an organization in Boston called United for a Fair Economy, and they were starting a new project called, and I was their first racial wealth divide coordinator, and did my first reports on trying to highlight and educate people about the difference between income inequality and wealth inequality, and the impact that's having on racial inequality. Back at that time, 2004, still kind of riding high, and at least people thought we were riding high because of the 90s strong economy. but was highlighting that actually there was still great income inequality for African Americans and even greater wealth inequality. And, no matter what organization's been, NAACP, Prosperity Now NCRC, I do different programmatic administrative work, but I focus heavily on educating and want to more and more develop stronger practices and local policies around addressing racial wealth inequality.
So you hit the first question I really want to dig into, because I think people don't realize there is a difference between income inequality and wealth inequality. And it's funny because I share with people, like, even from my experience, as I've been passionate about this issue over really like the last 3 to 4 years, I've been digging in deep, reading a whole lot more. I saw a lot of cities who have done a color wealth study, which I hope that we can end up doing here in Columbia eventually, to really know where we are. I think a lot of us have a good estimate of where we are, but I think we would be surprised to see where we are as far as wealth, especially in communities of color. But I share with people a lot of times that, you can have a good income, but you may not have wealth. And it was interesting because years ago, I would always do like, okay, my New Year's goals, this year I'm going to work on getting my credit better. And of course, you need to have good credit, but I was always kind of focused on the credit score. And not really looking at my net wealth. And, the thing is, you have good credit. Most of the time, most people want good credit so that they can get more debt. And you can make a ton of money, but if you have a ton of debt, then you actually don't have wealth. And when you look at systemically, and especially in communities of color, a lot of us feel like we've arrived when we're making a decent amount of money. We can have, this house or this car, but, we're still living paycheck to paycheck, and that affects our communities in different ways. So I think until we kind of understand that there's a difference between income inequality and wealth inequality, and although there's a correlation, of course, between the two, there's a difference. I'm not sure that we can ever really, truly start addressing the issue. So from your expertise and your background, can you explain to the folks who are listening, what is wealth inequality, and particularly as it relates to communities of color, and pretty much the history of how do we get to where we are and really what it is? Because I think people will be astounded to know kind of what the numbers are right this second.
Yeah. And I'll focus on Black and white, and, we can talk a little bit more about Latino or Asian American if also desired, but just to kind of get out numbers and not make them too confusing. There's still great income inequality. One, I don't want to ignore income inequality. I think the median income for Black households around $42,000 a year, which as we all know, is not that much money for a household, right? So that's not per person, that's for the entire household. The median household income for whites isn't still a lot of money, but it's significantly more. It's about $70,000, $71,000. So you see a significant disparity there. African Americans and Latinos have around 65% of the income of whites, if you look at the median household income. So significant disparity, hasn't been bridging that much, so not a great situation. But wealth is even deeper inequality. And again, just like, what is wealth? You were noting you can have a nice car, a nice home. You can have those things, but those things don't develop into wealth until you've paid off a good amount of that mortgage, right? So you've paid off more than you owe on that mortgage, right? Or similarly, a car. You have a big fancy new car, but that's people think of it as a symbol of wealth, but it's most of the time it's just debt. And actually is draining your wealth. I say all the time, my 2008 Prius is a much more part of my wealth portfolio than a fancy new Tesla or something like that I'm still paying off, right? And so wealth, wealth would be your assets minus your debts. And I think wealth is so important because wealth gives, I think, a more comprehensive overview of your economic well-being. You can have a high income one year, particularly if you're an entrepreneur, have a low income another year. Those things can go up and down, but it might not radically change your economic position. Your wealth gives a much clearer understanding of where you are economically, and wealth really helps determine your ability to deal with economic crisis, and also provides resources that allows you to take advantage of economic opportunity. And so I think you'll see oftentimes in middle income or even high income African American households, they're not able to deal with economic crises or take advantage of economic opportunities because there isn't that reservoir of wealth. So what is wealth inequality? It's hard to get wealth data, so I use Consumer Survey Finances, which comes out every 3 years. The last data that's out is from 2016. There should be some new data coming out for 2019, but it hasn't come out as of yet. The 2016 data shows that African American wealth was around $3,400. The median wealth for African American households, $3,400. The median wealth for white households was almost $150,000. So you see that massive disparity. You're seeing that, again, African Americans had about 60 cents on every dollar of income that whites had, but they only have about 3 cents of every dollars of wealth. And, as we are in this time where, we were having record low levels of unemployment to this, what I call a COVID depression. If you only have a median wealth of, $3,400, that's not much to fall back on. And median means 50% of African Americans have more than that, and 50% of African Americans have less. So it makes this, this economic challenging time that much more serious for not just low income, not just median income, but oftentimes fairly high income African American households.
That is so important because, and I don't have the numbers in front of me. We're kind of a year or two behind, but the last scorecard for Prosperity Now, and of course, had South Carolina as ranking, one of the lowest when it talks about wealth in African American families. And the last one I saw had us about the majority, or I guess the median Black families had a negative net wealth. Yeah. Net worth. So I think that, that's something that most people don't think about. And so, of course, that's normal with COVID-19. And I like the way you said that COVID-19 depression, it really has impacted everybody in a different way. And I heard Don Lemon say, and I repeat this, several people have heard me say this several times. He talked about COVID-19 being the great equalizer, to the point where it didn't matter who you were, where you were. Sorry, who you were, where you were.
We're talking about this new COVID reality. That's part of that new COVID reality. Yeah. There's a kid somewhere, always. It's right? In the background. That's right. That's right.
But it can affect anybody. But it also is the great magnifier because it magnified so many issues in our community, the health disparities, racial wealth inequality, access to just, things that make you survive. And so, it's been interesting for me as an elected official, everybody's like, okay, we've got to address all this stuff that's happening in COVID. Well, we weren't addressing things beforehand. And so now you're trying to put a Band-Aid on stuff that, it needs major surgery.
That's right.
And so where do you start? Where do you start with that? So tell us from what you're seeing nationally, how has COVID magnified the racial wealth gap? And, are we even in a position to start addressing it in a meaningful way, knowing how bad we were already?
Yeah, I mean, we're still at early stages, particularly as it relates to wealth, because it's hard to get good wealth data. But again, what we do know is if in 2016, which was like 7 years of economic recovery, that if median wealth was at $3,600, $3,500 for African Americans, that again, that's not much to fall back on if you're losing your jobs, right? We've all seen there have been record levels. I mean, just astounding levels of unemployment claims being put forward, right? I think it hit its peak at around almost 4 million one week, and it's gone down to, I think, a little over 2 million last week. We'll get some new numbers this Thursday. But before this COVID time, I think the record level, like that happened in the Great Recession for unemployment claims, was 800,000. So even as we're going on a decline, we're still having massive levels of unemployment. We're actually seeing, white unemployment, drastically increase as well. Black, Latino, everybody's unemployment levels has drastically increased. But I think when you look at wealth inequality, one of the things you're going to see is that if the median wealth of whites is almost $50,000, that's a lot more to fall back on and to maybe keep yourself going than if the median wealth is $3,500. And so I think even if unemployment numbers are more similar than they have been in the past, which is true, it doesn't mitigate the different economic impact it's having on communities, and I think we will. And historically, we have seen that what happens with recessions is that African Americans are the last to recover, right? So we didn't see, and Latinos, Black and Latino wealth didn't start rebounding, not only from the Great Recession of 2007, but from a small recession in 2000. It didn't. It just was constantly going down until 2016, where it started going up, right? And so that was almost 16 years of decline. We just started seeing an increase in median wealth, and now with this COVID depression, we don't know how long it's going to be, but I think it's going to drastically cut back any improvement African Americans were seeing in median wealth. And I'm very concerned about long-term employment possibilities and even housing value. I mean, I think there's a question of how long this goes, and will this affect housing value, particularly in urban areas where people are concerned to be in with a pandemic like COVID still with us, and we don't know for how long will be with us.
It's interesting because one of the things, one of the not newer, but one of the books I'm reading now on my book list is the Color of Law. And I think you may have mentioned this when we met too, but a couple people recommended it to me, so I'm reading it. And for those of you who might not be familiar with it, the book talks about the history of this country and how government policies have added to segregation in this country, clearly has added to racial wealth inequalities as well. So with that, where are we? I think with policies, I just think that so many times, like I said, even you can have well-meaning people in positions of power or elected folks who are trying to do things, for instance, zoning laws and things, but they do add to the wealth gap in this country. Tell me, can you share with us just some of your thoughts on that and maybe some of the insights of things that we don't really think about top of mind, but really are hurting us more than helping us?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think one of the big things is just, recognition of racial economic inequality and racial wealth inequality. Because I think people keep trying to create policies that are colorblind. And if you create policies that are colorblind in a society that is divided by, racial, or we're in a society where race and economic status are so closely connected, you will not have a colorblind effect in your policy. You will see that your policy is particularly helpful to some, harmful to others. And so I think there needs to be an analysis up front. Okay, we know there's racial economic inequality. We know that a deep part of this is racial wealth inequality. So even if you're talking about, I think people get this confused too. They think that, a household making a good amount of money, $100,000 a year, you'd think, well, Black and white are equal in their economic status. But again, you're going to see that Black households have drastically less wealth than whites, or vice versa. You can look at the poorest 20%, right? I think it's like below $19,000 a year. And you see the median wealth for whites at that level is around $3,000, which isn't that much money. But the median wealth for blacks and Latinos is $0 for households making less than 19. So if you create programs and policies, people, households that have low-income households that have $3,000 are going to have some more stability, probably more opportunity to take advantage of that than others. So you really, any policy that's not at the front end thinking about racial wealth inequality and how that policy is going to address and hopefully help bridge that is a policy that more likely than not will make racial economic inequality, racial wealth inequality worse. And I think that's part of the challenge that we've been having. Like we've seen, very little. I think in the late 1990s, we saw a little bridging of racial wealth inequality where African Americans maybe got up to median wealth of around 15,000 and whites had around 100,000. It was still a very stark difference, but that's as close as we've gotten. And we generally have been seeing just greater inequality since that time period.
So that's interesting too, because one of the things that I've seen is just even how people are trying to address things in a, like you mentioned, a colorblind, color neutral type way. If you don't acknowledge where we've been or where we even are now, moving forward, you're going into it blindly. So with that said, and I think I asked you this question when I met you, because I was still trying to decide who I was going to be supporting in the primary. There was a lot of talk, and always is of elected officials, politicians, people wanting our vote, saying this is what I'm going to address. And sometimes things sound good. There are so many proposals out there. There's, people talk about reparations. People talk about, housing and making sure that, you have equality in housing and financing. There's so many proposals out there. From the things that you've heard, not just from presidential candidates or during this season, but just universally, what are some of the policies I think that need more attention from us as supporters or as voters to be educated about it and look at trying to get passed in some form or another to really start addressing this issue?
Yeah, last year I did a report with the Institute for Policy Studies titled 10 Solutions to Bridge the Racial Wealth Divide. And it was, just that, taking, the Democratic primary was going strong, a lot of people putting forth different ideas, and we were highlighting the 10 policies that we thought could have the most substantive impact on the racial wealth divide in particular. And not any one policy is going to do everything. And so we had a vast array of different types of policies, everything from, Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity, our economists who are noted for their baby bond proposal, which is this idea of, providing some type of really children's savings account to kids as they were born. And usually it's pretty progressive. So a certain amount, 10,000 when they're born, and it increases every year so that by the time they become 18 or 21 or whatever the age is, they might have $50,000 in assets that they can access to help them with home ownership, higher education, entrepreneurship, these types of things. And so, I think, that proposal is very important because it understands that one of the best ways to bridge racial wealth inequality and to bridge wealth inequality is to make sure that all Americans have some type of wealth to fall back on or utilize. I've heard Jesse Jackson speak about trying to be capitalist when you have no capital. Like, it just doesn't work that well, right? And I think that is a challenge for many Americans, and disproportionately African Americans and Latinos. We've also highlighted such things as guaranteed employment and a significant higher minimum wage, and I think, we're starting to see, historically, African Americans have twice the unemployment rate of whites. So it's really hard to build wealth if you're unemployed, if your employment's insecure, if you can't even guarantee a certain amount of regular pay each week. Even those who have jobs, we can only get 12 hours one week and then 30 hours the next week and then 10 and then 60 hours, right? It makes your whole life impossible to manage, whether it's childcare or paying your bills. So trying to have some type of guaranteed employment that allows all Americans to have some type of fallbacks. These are kind of big federal policies. We had things, like you said, about affordable housing, a huge issue for African Americans. African Americans only are homeowners at about a rate of 41%. 41% of African Americans are homeowners as compared to white Americans who are around 71, 72% homeowners. So, we have to increase Black home ownership and Latino home ownership if you want to bridge racial wealth inequality. And we've also, reparations. Sandy Darity just put a book out that I haven't read yet on reparations and what reparations could look like in the 21st century. I do think reparations can be helpful. I do like to note, though, that even a broad, serious investment among reparations probably would not bridge the racial wealth divide by itself, because we have a very, what I call, regressive economy. That is, that the more the economy grows, as the economy grows, the wealth and income gets concentrated to the highest paid, or those with the most assets already. So if you kind of fuel reparations into African American households in a regressive economy, it's going to have a much more limited effect, because the economy itself is concentrating wealth at the top, and there's so few African Americans there. So I think, even with reparations, we also need a large progressive reforms for the economy as a whole. One other thing I just put forward is also just highlighted this idea of a racial wealth analysis, that when we're doing policies, there needs to be at the front end an analysis of, well, how will this affect African Americans and Latinos, given that their median income is this, their home ownership rates are this, their median wealth is this. How do we expect this policy to strengthen, weaken, help these communities and bridge inequality? If we had more of that type of analysis at the front end, I think, we could have policies that start bridging this equality instead of maintaining it or sometimes strengthening it. But, those weren't all 10. People can look at just Google the report, 10 solutions to bridge the racial wealth divide, and see these kind of large national solutions that we put forward.
Right. I'll Google that, and those of you watching the replay, I'll post a link to that, because I think that's definitely worth a read. So the main reason I like to do this is because I feel like there are so many conversations that we talk about on the surface, but we don't really try and educate ourselves about learning more and then advocating for ourselves to make sure that these policies are being moved forward, that we have people who are representing us who understand these policies. I mean, I'll just be honest. I mean, even here in South Carolina, both of our senators have said they're not voting for any more stimulus package, and basically even both of them made a comment that there are people that they don't believe people should make more on unemployment than they made before they were working, because they're not going to go back to work. And so it's been kind of difficult kind of seeing the fact that we've got folks who are affected, particularly by, this issue, but more so during COVID-19. But we don't know how to advocate for ourselves in any way, shape, or form. And so I'm trying to make sure that people are empowered with information. With that said, how can more everyday people be involved in the conversation, be involved in affecting policy, be informed on how do we advocate for ourselves to make these change? And I know it didn't happen overnight. It's not going to, the solution's not going to happen overnight. But if we don't talk about it constantly, we're definitely not going to have policies that help affect it. So how can we, how when you do your education, what do you want people to do? Like when they hear you and hear this information, what action can people start taking to be more of an advocate for ourselves, to really have good policies in place and having this as part of the main conversation instead of just kind of an aside when somebody's trying to get our vote?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, one thing, one of my favorite people coming out of the civil rights movement, Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, he'd always say, organize, organize, organize. So I think it is important that you be part of some type of organization that is engaged in public policy, at least public policy education, and hopefully public policy advocacy, right? Because it's, one thing, we all need to educate ourselves. And I, put out, there's a thing called Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide Facebook page, which I put forward articles 5 days a week to try to help people learn more about racial economic inequality, racial wealth inequality. I'm part of something called the Race and Wealth Podcast Network, where we have a series of shows, some with myself on them, some with people like Angela Glover Blackwell out of oftentimes California, former head of Policy Link, talking about different issues of racial economic inequality. So trying to create different ways that people can learn more about it. And then I'm hoping they can take their understanding and share that with the organizations, their friends, and then apply that to the policy discussions they're engaged in, or motivate them to be more engaged in various policy conversations. I think one exciting thing is, you talked about politicians saying they're not going to fund any more economic stimulus. I mean, the truth is, we have yet to fund economic stimulus. What we've been funding thus far is trying to create an economic lifeline to keep the economy going. A lifeline is different than a stimulus. Like, we were just trying to make sure that some type of the economy maintained itself while so many businesses had to close. And I know we're in a period of reopening, but I think we're going to find out that it can be not that profitable to open your business when people are still scared to come into your business, right? Even if 50% of your, or let's say 70% of your customers come in, most businesses know that they can't survive on 70% of their customer base. They need 90, they need 100, 110% in order to be more profitable than they were in the past. So I think, we're going to see that the kind of, so consumer dollars that we've been so reliant on, it's not going to be flowing in the same way for quite a while, which means then that we're going to have public investments to maintain and make sure that people aren't depleting all of their own personal wealth, that they're not losing all of their businesses, because the more pain that people go through, the more challenging it's going to be to reinvigorate the economy. And I'm sure, people are going to try to draw a hard line, but I'm sure when they see the dangers that's approaching the economy in the next 3 months, 6 months, that they will, as has always done, try to bail out the economy. The question is, are they going to bail out big corporations? Or are we going to bail out, individuals, small businesses? And we usually bail out the largest corporations and then wonder why working class people are doing so poorly. And so I'm hoping that we all can be mobilized and make sure that when the bailout does come, and it will come out again, that it actually is a bottom-up bailout versus a trickle-down bailout where we barely even receive a trickle.
That is so true. It's been disheartening, really disheartening to see the businesses that are really still just struggling. And one of the things that I think about all the time is the fact that you tell people to open up, but then schools aren't open. So people who are parents, a lot of working class families are parents. You've got that struggle as well. And then a lot of us are on the front lines of the essential businesses. And so if you don't have access to proper health care, proper PPE and other things, then, we're the ones that are kind of put out there. So it's such an important topic. And I hope that we can continue not just to talk about it, but actually really be putting some things in place to continue, not just to give ourselves, like you said, a lifeline, but to keep moving forward as a community.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something?
Yeah. And I think too, what you had said before about how COVID magnifies, I think one of the things that COVID really did is it magnified the lack of infrastructure, public infrastructure we had, whether it was public health infrastructure, the ability even to develop masks and get them out, the ability to, treat people when all of a sudden there's a big increase in people needing emergency room or hospitalization. And also too, we see there's a lack of infrastructure on well, if the economy does shut down because of some national healthcare crisis, we don't even have good pathways of making sure that people are getting the money they need, the food they need, these types of things. So it really is highlighting weaknesses in our infrastructure. And let's say that we get, let's say we get a vaccine in the next 3 months, and then it takes maybe a year to get it all throughout the country. There will still be another health disaster, another weather disaster, something that will happen that we will need a public infrastructure to help us get through. And I'm hoping that maybe, we've had a lot of regional disasters, and then we wonder why, how come the poor are doing so bad in this situation, or African-American community doing so bad in this situation. And it's because we do a weird thing in this country. We do provide public infrastructure, but usually only to those who have, or we provide the best public infrastructure to those who have the highest amount of private assets. And so those who have the least private assets, they also get the least public infrastructure. And so they are completely in a bad situation when they're not able to work as they had in the past, and don't have much public infrastructure to support them. So again, I'm hoping that people can come together and really push to change the way this country's been going for the last 30, 40 years, where we've been concentrating not only private assets among the wealthiest, but even public assets and public infrastructure among the wealthiest.
Oh, that's great. So I know you mentioned the Facebook page. What are some other resources? Like if there are people watching, and I see Sylvia Jenkins, hey Sylvia, says true, she's loving this conversation. If there are other folks who want to know more, what are some other resources that you would direct people to learn more and to really help them be in a position to advocate for better policy?
So I recommended that. I recommend too, I have a WordPress page that is called Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide. And that has all of my writings in the past. And that's a place that people can go to get information. We just put out something if you want to understand Asian Americans and racial economic inequality. We just did an Asian American racial wealth snapshot. We've done African American racial wealth snapshot, Latino racial wealth snapshot. So there's a lot of information there. I mentioned we have a Racial Wealth Podcast Network. I also note there's another podcast called Brokish by two women out in Texas. That's one of my favorite Black economic podcasts out there, and recommend that people look that up. Brokeish. As I noted, there's a new book by Sandy Darity on reparations. Actually, I'm blanking on the name of it, but I'll pull it up and share it with people. But think that is a resource that people can Google and find information. But I think all of those are areas that, and the thing about the Facebook page and the podcast is we don't just focus on my work, but on other people, whether it's Mariko Chang or Sandy Darity or Ann Price. There's more and more people writing about these issues. And, I think it'll be easier and easier for people to get more information. And the name of the book I was talking to you about around reparations was From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black America. And that just came out about a year or so ago.
Great. Well, before we close, my last question for you really is, and I always say this, and then I'll let you say anything else you want to do as a closing statement. But my last question is, I'm always trying to explain why this is an issue that everybody needs to be concerned about. This isn't an issue just for Black America. If Black America is strong, America is strong. So what's your response to that? Like, why is this an issue that everybody should be concerned about, not just African Americans?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's two spaces. One, wealth has been concentrating among the wealthiest for all Americans, right? So there's greater, so even so white Americans too are seeing that they are not getting the share of growth in the economy that they used to previous to say 1980, right? It used to be as the economy grew, middle income and even lower income would see their incomes grow as much, if not more, than high income Americans. Growing wealth inequality is something that everyone is dealing with. But then for Blacks and Latinos, you put Blacks and Latinos together, you see that's an increasingly large part of the population. And so it's hard to have, one of the big things celebrated in the United States was this great American middle class economy. Well, if as Blacks and Latinos are becoming closer and closer to becoming 50% of this country's population, you can't have a strong middle class economy if the median median wealth between Blacks and Latinos is around $7,000 or $8,000, right? You can't have a middle class economy if 50% of the population's in asset poverty. And that is where we have been going, and that is where we continue to move toward. So, if we want our economy to be strong as it's been historically, we have to, and one thing people don't know is that America wasn't always a middle class economy, right? It wasn't until after the New Deal and World War II and massive investments in terms of education, home ownership that went disproportionately to white Americans that we create a great white American middle class. And that was in the mid 20th century. We have to create a new great American 21st century middle class that's racially inclusive for the first time. And that will really, allow this country to maintain its strong economic and with that democratic well-being for the future. So it really is essential for all of us who want the country to prosper and maintain itself.
It's wonderful. Excellent. So is there anything I didn't ask you or you feel like we need to know? I know one thing, we just need to continue the conversation, and I can't wait till things get a little bit more. I know we won't really be back to normal. We have a new normal, but I can't wait till things get better where I can start having a lot more stuff here. And I'd love to invite you to famously hot Columbia and have a real conversation with some of my community leaders. But outside of that, is there anything I haven't asked you that you feel like we need to be aware of, or at least thinking about as we're thinking about a path forward?
I would just say that we all need to not be scared to, as everyone talks about how to rebuild and how to heal from this space, not consider it divisive to bring up, well, how are we going to do that with racial equity at the forefront? Because what's truly divisive is not bringing that up and then creating ways of getting to a new normal that continues the historic racial divide, particularly as it relates to economics. And that is what will occur unless we at the forefront think about, okay, we want to heal. People are starting to come out. We want to rebuild businesses. We want to figure out ways of rebuilding communities. How can we do this to make sure that communities that have been historically disenfranchised are placed at the center? And this time, as we're rebuilding our local economy, our state economy, our national economy, we don't just rebuild what we had in the past, which is mass disenfranchisement, but we actually create a space where it's more possible for all of us to prosper and sustain ourselves.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. So before we close, let everybody know how they can follow your work. We've got the Facebook page and other stuff, but where else? How can they contact you? How can they follow you and keep up to speed on all of this in addition to the Facebook page?
Yeah, I think I gave you the Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide Facebook page. I have a Dedrick Asante-Muhammad Facebook page. We just want to follow my work, the Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide WordPress. I have a Twitter at Dedrick M if you're interested in that. I even have an Instagram I just started a few months ago, which is Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide Instagram. And so find your favorite social media venue and use that, and check out our podcast at raceandwealth.com.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you for two things. Number one, thank you for being here and giving such great information. But also thank you for your work in this. I mean, this is definitely a yeoman's work. It is massive. And your dedication to this, to bringing awareness, to bringing education, and bringing real, solutions for people to think about is important. So I thank you for this work, because this gives me hope when I hear people want to address this issue. And like I said, I'm still a baby in this, learning. I'm trying to learn everything that I can, because I feel like as a policymaker, it's my job to know as much as I can to make sure I'm doing what I can do. But you've made it easy to, at least for me, to get up to speed on watching what you do and watching what you put out. You have a newsletter too, because I get your newsletter. How can people get on your newsletter list?
That is true. How can people get on my newsletter list? People can email me at NCRC, D Asante-Muhammad at ncrc.org. Email me and just ask. We have a race, wealth, and community newsletter that highlights the work being done out of National Community Reinvestment Coalition, where I oversee fair housing, fair lending, entrepreneurship, and trying to expand work into the racial wealth inequality. So people, again, can email me at dasante-muhammad at ncrc.org and just, make the subject Race, Wealth, and Community newsletter, and we'll put you on the list.
Great. Well, thank you again for being here and for all the great information. And those of you who are watching live, thank you so much for being here. And those of you who are watching the replay, thank you. And please continue to share this. We got to get more and more people to have this information. And like I said, I promise that when things get a little bit back to normal, I'm going to continue this conversation, have some folks together to actually meet Dedrick personally and hear him and be able to ask questions, because I know some of you may have questions. Ann Watson says, thank you for sharing. So thank you, Ann, for watching. But we'll make sure that you can get into some questions. So until next time, I have got so many other topics that we're going to bring to you shortly. So continue to follow me on my social media so that we can continue to bring you some great conversations. And if there's some topics that I haven't brought you that you want to hear or learn more about, please email me or text me and say, Tameika, hey, bring somebody on to talk about something, because this is your forum. This is your venue to learn more, not just about what we're doing here in Columbia, but nationally. So until next time, I'm Councilwoman Tameika Isaac Devine. I'm getting my own name wrong. Tameika Isaac Devine, and I will see you guys a little bit later. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right.